Hi everybody, welcome to Basics with Blake. I am Blake, Icy Clench here on Lead Chess and Discord. Today we're going to be going over one of Ruben Fine's 30 chess principles. The first one, in fact, we just start with a pawn in the center. And we're also going to be looking at two games played by Paul Morphy, and I've read them from this book, A First Book of Morphy by Frisco del Rosario. And basically, it illustrates Ruben Fine's 30 principles through Morphy's games. So we're going to go over the first game in the book for this first game here. So Morphy has the white pieces, and Jabez Carr is playing the black pieces. So, okay, the principles start with a pawn in the center. So only 4 center squares, and there are only 2 moves to get your pawns there. E4 and D4 should be the only 2 moves that you consider first. Okay, so black is Dr. Jabez Carr, and he is not going to play in the center of the board. In fact, he's going to try making fun of Morphy, because not only is Morphy playing Mr. Carr here, he is playing 7 other people, and he's also blindfolded while he's playing all of these games. So he's going to purposely play what he thinks is a bad move to make fun of Morphy. Okay, if starting with 1 pawn in the center, unopposed, is a good principle, then it should follow that 2 pawns in the center must be twice as good. So Morphy plays pawn to d4. Black continues playing on the edges with pawn to a5. Okay, so here we should pause and ask ourselves, why is it important that we play in the center of the board? Well, not only do these 2 center pawns take away a lot of squares from the enemy pieces, the center pawns have also freed up our bishops to move out, and even this queen can move out as well. Another reason we like occupying the center of the board is because the center is really close to every other part of the board. It's close to your pieces, it's close to the enemy pieces, it's close to the queen side, to the king side. Anywhere that you need to be, attacking or defending, if you can maneuver your pieces through the center, you can get there the quickest. Right? The shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line, and the center happens to be in the center of pretty much every line that you can make on the chessboard. So really important that we play in the center here. Plus, if we play in the center and our opponent is not playing in the center, he could find that his pieces become uncoordinated, because again, they cannot move around to what's important on the board. Okay, so continuing for Morphy, he's not going to make any more pawn moves. He's for the most part, he's got his 2 center pawns. Now the plan is to do the other important things from the opening. So center pawns, we want to develop the knights and bishops and get them close to the center, and we want to castle. And the reason Morphy started with his e-pawn was because if he develops his bishop on f1 and knight on g1, this allows for the fastest castling. That's why he didn't choose d4. So d4 is a playable move, but maybe you don't get to castle quite as quick. Morphy really likes castling very fast. Okay, so a very natural looking move is knight to f3, maybe even one that I would play. Not only does this bring the knight out, it controls the center on d4 and e5. And we're clearing a piece out to castle. Morphy, however, wants to use his f-pawn. The one drawback of this move is it blocks the pawn from coming up to f4, which is actually part of Morphy's plan. When he moves the pawn up to f4, not only will it support on e5, but he could even potentially march it up some more and keep attacking the opponent. Okay, so this knight is going to find a different square. Sure, Morphy could play pawn to f4 and then knight to f3, but this wastes a little bit of time getting castled, as we've discussed. So the next best square for the knight besides f3, don't go to the edge. Closer to the center is e2, but this comes with another drawback. The bishop on f1 is blocked now. So it should follow that maybe we need to develop this bishop first. Okay, where should the bishop go? Not e2, that's where the knight wants to go, plus not next to the center. d3 is a maybe, it looks close to the center. c4 is a maybe, it looks close to the center. b5 does not control the center, and a6 you get captured. Morphy does not choose bishop to c4. The reason is, although this bishop for the moment has a nice open diagonal and he's attacking on f7, the weak pawn next to the king, black could block off the mobility of this bishop by playing a pawn move with pawn to e6. And now the bishop is not doing a very good job attacking the pawn, as it is supported by two other pawns here. The bishop does control the d5 square, which could be a benefit if black wants to try to get a pawn on d5. So this still might be a playable move. But Morphy chose the move bishop to d3, so his bishop could be a little more active on the diagonal. So right now it looks like he's not so active because he's blocked off by a pawn. But Morphy is simply thinking ahead that this center pawn could move up, and then with this pawn moved up, the bishop will have a much greater range on the diagonal here. Okay, so black plays pawn b6, still on the edges. Maybe he could bring the bishop out somewhere. White continues with the plan. Morphy plays knight e2. Black plays pawn to e6. Finally, with a little bit of center control, although it might be too late to get a pawn onto d5. Morphy castles, and black finally decides to start bringing out some of his minor pieces. He plays bishop a6. Okay, so Morphy's looking pretty good. Two center pawns, his king's castled, and he's got some development and open lines for even his undeveloped pieces. Black, he's moved a couple pawns, not anywhere near the center, and he's finally got one bishop out, but this bishop is on the edge of the board. So if the center is the most important part of the board, and it's good to get the pawns there, it should follow that it's also good to get the rest of our pieces there, like the knights and bishops. So a piece that's near the center of the board is more valuable than a piece on the edge of the board. Okay, so we can see black's offering a trade of bishops with his last move. If Morphy were to capture, not only would he lose a developed piece and allow black to bring another one in, but he loses the good bishop for the bad bishop, which is another reason we don't want to play moves that allow black to capture our bishop. Okay, and we don't want to really move this bishop again, not that he has anywhere to move to. Morphy finds a move to block the trade of bishops. He plays pawn to c4. And now we can see that black's bishop here on the edge of the board is actually being a really bad piece. It's blocked off by this pawn. Morphy's bishop still is going to retain its mobility because it can move up to e5 with the pawn, and the bishop will have his diagonal opened up. Okay, black brings out another piece, and he tries coming towards the center with knight to f6, but because he did not start with any center control, any pawns in the center, this knight is actually going to get kicked out. This is one of the real reasons we like having center pawns. This pawn can move up to e5, and now the knight has to move away. Again, no center control means the black knight cannot come into the center of the board. He has to move to the edge. He has to be careful where he moves. Again, consider your piece mobility. If the knight moves to g4, well, no squares are safe or otherwise legal for this knight. And another pawn move means this knight has to give himself up for, at most, a pawn. And same thing happens if he moves over to h5, another pawn move, and all of the knight squares are taken away. So this knight moves over to h7 to stay in the game. Although he's really not so much in the game. He's still on the edges of the board. But now we see the diagonals open for the bishop. He's even got a target with the knight on h7, but we don't really want to capture the knight for the same reason as before. Good bishop in the center and bad knight on the edge of the board. And he's almost in the corner on that square. So knight h7, and remember why Morphy didn't put his knight on f3. He didn't want to block the mobility of his f-pawn. So while you do have moves like knight to c3 to get another piece out, might be what I play, Morphy plays pawn to f4, starting a little kingside attack with the pawn. Okay, and now we can see Morphy's center control is actually very massive. He's got the pawn protecting here on d5, e5 twice, and there are even other plans to keep marching up to attack black. Black's pieces are scattered here on the edges of the board and don't work very well together. Okay, if black wants to castle, the next piece that he needs to move is his bishop. But the bishop has no good squares near the center. Again, the center pawns take away all these squares that the enemy pieces could have moved to. So he moves bishop to e7. Okay, Morphy's plan is a king side attack, so he's going to move some pieces over to the king side. Maybe knight c3 is a move. There are other ideas. Move a bishop out as well. Morphy plays knight to g3. Again, moving over to the king side for an attack. Okay, black plays pawn to d5. Perhaps he played this move because he saw a move like queen to f3 from Morphy, which could threaten the rook. So pawn d5, and now Morphy spots another weak target, which is the g7 pawn. So he's going to bring the queen over to attack it. Queen to g4, and black is hard-pressed to find a defense for this pawn. He can't play any moves like bishop f6 protecting the pawn because of Morphy center pawns, and he can't play other moves like knight g5, which would block the queen, again because of these pawns which are near the center. So black decides to castle. This might not be the best move because black's king is on the same file as white's queen here. So perhaps black is castling into the attack. g7 is still weak. There's one attacker and one defender, so Morphy piles on another attacker. He plays knight to h5. And again, black has a hard time defending this piece. Same thing, bishop and knight can't come over because of these pawns. And otherwise, it looks like black's pieces are really uncoordinated. They really can't come over to defend in any way. So black makes a good calculation. He doesn't play pawn to g6. This could actually give Morphy a really nice sacrifice and checkmating idea. After bishop takes pawn, pawn takes, queen takes pawn, check, king h8, and queen g7 checkmate. And if you don't take the bishop, there are other discovered check ideas of playing something like bishop takes pawn with check, or maybe even just bishop back check, and the same queen g7 mate idea. So black plays pawn to g5, although now his king is starting to look a little exposed here. Morphy's going to capture to try and open this part of the board up. It looks like knight takes g5, or maybe even bishop takes g5 might be an idea. However, this piece has just been put into a pin, and one of the things you do to pin pieces is you attack them. So white could play pawn to h4, winning a knight for a pawn. So black must capture back with his pawn, otherwise Morphy is going to take with check. So pawn takes. And here, Morphy notices that these pieces over here are not doing a really great job of defending black's king. So what Morphy does is he takes away one of the only defenders of the king. Bishop takes h7, and black actually doesn't take this bishop. If he takes the bishop, he might find himself checkmated. There could follow moves like knight to f6 check. If you take that, there's a rook that's coming in, and depending on what black plays, there are a few checkmating ideas that might come in. So let's see, king over, checkmate. There's one idea, and let's see. And if you leave the knight here, again, there are still plenty of checkmating ideas. So check, and let's see, there's a checkmate here. There's some other similar looking checkmates. Check, there's a checkmate here. So lots of checkmating ideas with the white pieces being able to come in, but the black pieces being unable to defend. So after bishop takes knight, black moves over, king to h8. And Morphy has won at least a knight here, which is nice, although he's got a very strong checkmating attack still going as well. Okay, so Morphy really wants to play queen h5 and make a check that could lead to a lot of checkmates. So he's going to start getting these pieces out of the way. First move he plays is knight to f6. Again, don't take the knight because we've seen some of the same ideas that can happen after rook takes. and you let the rook in for a checkmate. Black's going to find himself checkmated in about 2 moves here if he doesn't, 2 or maybe 3 moves if he doesn't do something desperate. So he gets a desperate idea. He plays pawn takes c4, although we are not worried about this pawn while we are checkmating Black's king. Morphy gets the bishop out of the way to play queen to h5 check. And one of the reasons Morphy didn't play queen to h5 first was for this move. Queen takes d4 check. Okay, a desperado sacrifice of the queen to get her out of the line of checkmate. So, okay, it looks like Black's given up the queen, but White has an alignment problem. The queen and king are on the same diagonal. So Black finds a bishop move to attack both of them. Bishop c5 pins the queen to the king. And Morphy, realizing that the best piece he can get for the queen now is the bishop, plays queen takes bishop. Pawn takes the queen back. And Morphy still needs to get some of his other pieces out into the game. So he's going to bring another piece out and make a capture. Bishop takes g5. Black brings his piece out as well, knight c6, maybe with a threat on this pawn, although we're not worried about the threat on the pawn because we have really nice checkmating ideas here. One idea that Morphy has is if he wants to checkmate Black's king, he can try and bring a rook up to make checkmates. The reason rooks are very valuable is because they're really good at making checkmates. So if you don't have a queen, the next best piece is the rook. So rook f3, trying to get it over for checkmating ideas. Black doesn't want to get checked and checkmated, so he plays king to g7. Morphy finds a really beautiful sacrifice here to keep his idea going. He really wanted to play that rook to h3 check idea because it would lead to checkmate. So he plays the move, bishop h6 check. And here, well, if you move the king out of the way, you're at least going to lose the rook. Plus, you still have the problem of rook to h3 check coming in. And otherwise, you capture the bishop. And you allow rook h3 check. So the king has 2 squares, g7 and g5. If he goes king g7, there's checkmate in 1 on rook h7 checkmate. And on king g5, there is another checkmate. Rook to h5 check. This king can't move to g6 because of the bishop, so king to f4. And now Morphy needs to take away the third rank from the king. So he actually placed king to f2, using his own king in this attack. Now the black king is totally boxed in, and just to one more check from another piece, not from the knight, bishop, or rook. They are doing a good job of boxing this king in. So if you could check him with something like a pawn to g3, that should be checkmate. So after rook g8, don't be tempted by the gain of material, because pawn g3 leads to checkmate. Black has to play rook takes, and pawn takes is checkmate. So in this game, we really saw that because Black didn't start with a pawn in the center, and Morphy got his pawns controlling the center, Black couldn't really bring his pieces over to help fight Morphy's center over here, and his pieces ended up getting scattered near the edges of the board. And none of his pieces could pass through the center in order to attack. Morphy made good use of passing his bishop through the center in order to attack Black here. And his pieces overall just had more mobility because he was in the center and Black was not. Okay, let's look at another example. So let's see, this one I don't have memorized off the top of my head, but I do know this was played against, I believe his name is Lewis Owen, and it's called Owens defense. So the last one was the Carr defense, named after Carr. This one is Owens defense, named after Lewis Owen. Morphy's white again, pawn e4, pawn b6. And again, if your opponent lets you get these 2 pawns in the center here for free, and they're not going to get captured, you should play this right away. Pawn d4. Okay, so Black's idea was he plays bishop to b7. And again, it looks like there's he's making a threat against the e4 pawn, but not to worry. We can still bring more pieces out to defend. So a move like knight to c3 would be pretty good. It defends the pawn, but again, Morphy might actually want to move this pawn up to c4 to help control on a square like d5. So he's actually not going to play knight c3. He's going to play bishop to d3 to defend instead. Okay, black plays pawn to e6, and Morphy plays what looks like a beginner's move. Now, a normal looking move is knight to f3, but Morphy plays knight to h3. So again, Morphy's idea is he wants to move up his f-pawn. Knight to f3 blocks the f-pawn. Now the reason he's going knight to h3 here is because he wants to move that knight over to g5 to help attack black. And if he went f3 g5 or h3 g5, either way, in the end, he gets here in the same number of moves. Plus, he's not blocked off his queen or his f-pawn in the process. And black doesn't really have any threats of playing like bishop takes knight here. So this move is actually playable. Okay, so black continues. Pawn to d5. And here again we see there is a trade being offered, and it looks like an equal trade. And this is true. In fact, it's a center pawn for a center pawn. So it might be tempted to capture, but there's no real reason to do that. Black actually wouldn't capture back with this pawn. He would probably capture back with his bishop. One thing that his pawn is doing right here is it's blocking his own bishop. While it has a target, the bishop is actually supporting the capture on e4. But Morphy makes sure that this bishop is never going to free itself. He plays pawn to e5. So again, he's pushing up in the center. And now this bishop is blocked off from moving through the center of the board. So black's got his center pawns, but he didn't start with a pawn in the center, and now at least one of his pieces is blocked off. This knight cannot come to f6, which is near the center, and the bishop on f8 also cannot come near the center. So black's going to have some problems defending himself in this game. Okay, so black plays knight to e7. His plan is he wants to move the knight over to f5 to help attack d4. He could have played knight to h6 like Morphy kind of played here over on the edge. However, this knight could get captured on every step of the way over to f5. So perhaps this is why black didn't play this move, although the author suggests that it actually might be the better move. So the knight goes to e7. And let's see, Morphy castles. Okay, so we're castled by move 6. We're doing really good. And black plays knight to g6 rather than f5. So knight to g6 here. I suppose, again, black didn't like the capture here on the f5 square. So knight to g6. So he's made room for the bishop to develop. Again, I don't think there are great squares for the bishop to go. Maybe black could play a move like pawn to c5 to attack white's center. And then again, the move knight to f5 still looks pretty good, continuing to attack this center pawn. But let's see, after knight to g6, again, Morphy's plan, he didn't put the knight on f3 because he wanted to play pawn to f4. Bishop to e7, and pawn to f5 starting the attack. So Morphy's got better center control. His development looks pretty good. His pieces look very active. Black's pieces, not very close to the center. Maybe this g6 knight is the only good one at the moment. Morphy's king is castled, while black, he's actually still not castled, although he's one move away from castling. So now he's trying to open up the f-file for his rook by trading this pawn off. So black plays pawn takes on f5. If black had instead moved the knight maybe to a square like h4, then black's defenses start to show some weaknesses. For example, here on this e6 square, white could play queen to g4, and start attacking black. Okay, so e takes f5, and okay, bishop takes or rook takes. Morphy goes bishop takes. Fun fact about rooks is that they actually don't quite benefit from being in the center as much. On a blank chessboard, a rook has 14 squares to move to no matter where it is, which is not true of the other pieces. This knight on the edge of the board has only 4 spots to look at. If it were in the center, it would have 8. But rooks actually don't get a whole lot from being in the center. Okay, so bishop takes f5. And here he's supporting this diagonal, so he might be able to play pawn to e6 to try and disrupt black's position some more. But maybe black could defend by making more development moves. Okay, black plays a silly looking move, bishop to c8. So he's brought this bishop over to b7, and I guess he saw that it was blocked, so he moved it back to the c8 square again. Now challenging Morphy's bishop. So he's actually wasted 2 moves doing this. And Morphy's going to make him lose even more time. Perhaps better for black was just to keep developing with something like knight to d7, and if pawn to e6 takes, and let's see, the book actually gives bishop takes on g6 with check, pawn takes, and the queen g4 idea. If something like this, then black could play maybe knight to f8 and defending these pawns. And if white tries to fork these pieces, black could play queen to d6, creating a pin on the knight, or the queen's going to take on h2, supported by this rook. If my mouse wants to draw any arrows, I guess not. So maybe knight d7 continuing to develop is better. But bishop c8 was played. And after bishop takes, queen takes, black's going to lose even more time. So his queen's not really any better developed. And in fact, she's actually lost protection over this d5 pawn here. So white can continue bringing pieces out and making threats, particularly to this pawn. So now he plays knight to c3. And black has to decide if he wants to waste more time with moving the queen. And if he moves the queen, again, white can keep attacking this pawn with something like queen to f3. In the end, black's going to have to play pawn to c6. So black plays it here, pawn to c6, and Morphy plays bishop g5, developing and making a slight threat to black. So one of 2 things is going to happen. Either black's going to play bishop takes and let this knight come forward to g5 like our plan, or black lets us capture, which is what happens in the game. Black castles, and now we capture, and actually his knight has to go backwards. Perhaps black wanted to be able to capture this bishop with a different piece, so a move like queen to e6 would not force his knight to go backwards, and he still retains castling rights. So castles, the knight comes backwards now. Let's see. Yeah, knight to e7, and then queen to h5. And Morphy's bringing all of his pieces over to black's kingside, and black's pieces are going to have a hard time coming into certain squares to try and defend. Not only have certain paths been blocked off to his pieces, but Morphy center pawns take away the important squares from black's pieces. Okay, so white could play knight to g5 to attack h7 with the queen. Black plays h6, stopping this idea. And Morphy brings in more pieces. Rook to f3 with the idea of playing rook to g3, pinning this pawn so that white can play queen takes pawn on h6. So black blocks this idea with knight to g6 to avoid the pin. Morphy brings in more pieces. Rook a to f1. Queen to e6. And now the last white piece steps over to the king side, knight to e2. So all white's pieces are on the king side here. And let's see, the game continues with knight d7, but this knight will be of no help in this game because it can't go to the f6 square due to the pawn. So let's see, Morphy plays knight to f4. It says knight e to f4, but I'm pretty sure it's the knight from h to f4. I could be wrong, although it might not matter either way. So okay, black's kind of compelled to make an exchange here, or he's going to lose some material. So he could lose a pawn. So black's a little compelled to exchange. And knight takes f4, still attacking the queen. Queen goes to e7. Rook g3 because the knight on g6 is gone, still with this pinning idea. King h7, preventing queen takes h6. And now the other rook moves to f3. So the white pieces are inching forward. And white is threatening actually to play rook takes on g7 now, followed by the other rook swinging into g3. Okay, so black plays rook to g8 to defend. And white plays a peculiar move, knight to h3. So I remember a funny thing about this game was that actually both of white's knights had used this little corner square on h3. And now he has another threat with rook takes on f7. And he also has another threat of playing knight to g5 with a check on the king, again with some more threats to follow. Black plays pawn to g6. And Morphy finishes off the game with knight g5, check. Queen takes on g5. And he doesn't want to play king to g7 because of rook takes f7. Queen takes, knight takes, and black cannot take the queen back because his g-pawn is pinned. So queen takes on g5, and now not rook takes because this g-pawn is not pinned, but rook takes f7 check. King to h8, and now queen takes g5, and black resigns here. So black cannot take this queen back, or he gets checkmated in one move with rook h3 checkmate. So that does it for this video mostly. Those are two games by Morphy that demonstrate the power of having your pawns in the center. In this game, black's pieces were pretty scattered in the game, and it took a while to build up. But once Morphy had all of his pieces going in the attack, black really only found himself able to defend with a single knight and queen. Meanwhile, Morphy had two knights, two rooks, and a queen attacking black. So Morphy ultimately had more pieces attacking than black had defending because black could not use the center with his pieces to come and defend. So that's all for this video, and I'll see you guys around next time.